Hello and welcome to the Daily Pages with me, Nafis Mahmood, the show where we dive deep into the newspaper headlines to provide you with more context, commentary and analysis than our newspaper columns can offer. Now I'd like to introduce my guest this evening who joins me in the studio. He's travelled all the way up from London to be with us this evening in Blackburn in Lancashire. His name is Hector Marchetti and he is of the Bow Group, the oldest conservative think tank in the United Kingdom. Hector, it's a pleasure having you on the show. How are you this evening?
I'm well, thank you for having me here.
You're more than welcome. It's as I said, you've travelled all the way up to be here, and we do appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to a very interesting and robust, but instructive and constructive conversation. So, shall we get started?
Absolutely.
Okay. The first headline I have here is from the Independent Business Times. The headline reads: Radovan Karadzic guilty of Srebrenica genocide and crimes against humanity. So, in 1995. Karadzic, I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name right, but Karadzic was involved in the massacre of 8,000 Muslim men and boys in Srebrenica in Bosnia and a 44-month siege of Sarajevo during the Bosnian War in which thousands of civilians were killed. The total death toll from the war was 100,000. Now, the judge in the International Criminal Court today ruled that Karadzic was responsible for a propaganda campaign against Bosnian Muslims, presenting Bosnian Muslims as enemies. Is there a danger that something, perhaps not to that scale, but something similar could happen in this day and age? Because there is a lot of propaganda against Muslims. I just have to mention names like Donald Trump, but arguably also newspaper proprietors like Rupert Murdoch also. Is there a danger that the current level of Islamophobia could lead to widespread violence? We are already seeing an increase in the number of Islamophobic hate crimes, but these are usually by individuals against individuals. Is there a danger that something more organised and systemic could take place?
I think there is, but we wouldn't see it so much here in Western Europe, where we are relatively much more tolerant and we embrace multiculturalism of the different communities. I believe, though, that right now what we're seeing is, as you say, Islamophobia is on the rise. The best way to counter that is to bring up these kinds of stories and say why they were so wrong and how we can counter them as people under one nation state or between continents.
Okay, but what about, I did mention Rupert Murdoch as well. He has been tweeting in the past some pretty controversial, let's just say, tweets. After the Charlie Hebdo shootings, he said, quote, from Twitter, this is what he wrote: "Maybe most Muslims are peaceful, but until they recognize and destroy their growing jihadist cancer, they must be held responsible." Is that propaganda against Muslims?
It could be considered propaganda in the sense that Rupert Murdoch says news proprietor, but then you also did mention how about it's from individuals to individuals. That's not necessarily so much propaganda because it's not in the newspaper headlines, but what it is showing is gross ignorance. Okay,
well, one thing that was in the newspaper headlines back in November was this following headline from the Murdoch-owned The Sun: 1 in 5 Muslims have sympathy for jihadis. Now, that got widespread coverage, obviously being on the front page of The Sun, which sells 3 million copies a day. Just that alone would have given it widespread coverage, but it was discussed. Many of the other newspapers ran with that story as well. Interestingly, another paper owned by The Times, owned by Murdoch, The Times, in small print a few days later, which did not get much discussion, printed the following: "We reported the findings of a Survation poll of 1,000 British Muslims asked, how do you feel about young Muslims who leave the UK to join fighters in Syria? 14% of respondents expressed some sympathy and 5% a lot of sympathy. The survey did not distinguish between those who go to fight for Islamic State and those who join other factions in Syria, and it did not ask about attitudes towards ISIS itself. Our headline, 1 in 5 British Muslims has sympathy for ISIS, was misleading and failing to reflect this." Are the likes of Murdoch and other business people, similar to Trump, but in this case Murdoch, are they skewing and manipulating statistics and figures for some other agenda which has Islamophobia at its core?
I'm not sure if it's necessarily promoting Islamophobia. That is admittedly a consequence, but perhaps in this day and age where the news agenda is driven so much by the flashier headlines, if you have a worrying statistic like that, then of course it's going to sell more. The methodology which you mentioned in terms of sympathy, that's a very wide qualitative expression. So is it sympathy in terms of regret that these people are going or sympathy for the cause, which I very much doubt it was.
Very interesting. Also, those other factions in Syria which it refers to have been supported by the British government as well. So perhaps Murdoch, next time he's meeting with David Cameron, should ask him some questions. But let's move on then to our next story, The Telegraph. The headline is from The Telegraph. Croydon man arrested after confronting Muslim woman and telling her to, quote, explain Brussels. So this is Matthew Doyle, who apparently, if his Facebook page is to be believed, runs Grant Doyle Associates, a PR agency, and previously worked for a number of investment management companies such as WH Ireland. He was rebuked, hugely rebuked, and made a mockery of on Twitter yesterday and today by many people as a result of tweeting the following, quote, I confronted a Muslim woman yesterday in Croydon. That's in South London. So let me start that again. I confronted a Muslim woman yesterday in Croydon. I asked her to explain Brussels. She said, nothing to do with me, a mealy-mouthed reply. We'll look at his other quotes in a minute, but what do you make of that quote?
It's full of ignorance. It's ridiculous. I mean, how could you ask that question at such an insensitive time for somebody just in the street, another human being, another citizen of the country, presumably? It has no context whatsoever. The issue itself relates to free speech and tolerance. And as you yourself have said, Mr. Doyle has been ridiculed on social media, and that's just the British public having an amazing response and showing that such bigotry has no place here.
It's what we do best, isn't it? Our comedy is what we do best, and it's the best way to respond to whether it's racists, fascists on either side of the spectrum. Now, you mentioned context. Let's put Mr. Matthew Doyle into context, because that on its own is ridiculous. But there are other tweets on his Twitter feed which are beyond ridiculous. They are actually quite sinister. One of them is, vote Trump if you hate Islam. Another one, holy F-U-C-K. The towel head in my local kebab shop speaks no English, has no national insurance number, and was on his mobile to Syria. Another one, who cares if I insulted some towel head? Really? And another one, vote UKIP. We need to defend ourselves from Islamist threats. And also, in his tweets, he used the phrase Islamic bastards. So he's been arrested now on suspicion of inciting racial hatred.
Yes.
What's worrying is he seems to be a very well educated man, seems to have quite a lot of business experience, yet obviously unbelievably culturally ignorant, racist, bigoted, vile. He's not your quintessential racist, but is it worrying that racism is in all demographics, and somebody who seems to be as well educated as Mr. Matthew Doyle, as I said, worked for WH Ireland and many other investment management companies, is holding such views?
Well, racism holds no colour. That's why we should oppose it at every opportunity. Mr. Doyle was arrested, and this is the issue which I mentioned about free speech and tolerance. As I mentioned, the British public have reacted to this in the best possible way. But what's happened here is, and you mentioned context as well, this has happened in the wake of a horrible terrorist attack. He has aired his own views, which he is entitled to. Perhaps he should not have been arrested, because this is freedom of speech. It's brilliant until somebody says something that we disagree or dislike. What's happened here, with regards or without his arrest, we are having a debate on this. I realise that myself in some people's shoes as to what they would feel when they read these horrible things. But we are reacting to this positively. We are saying that it has no place, and that's far better than arresting somebody, because how far do you go from you can't say that to you can't think that?
Okay, I agree with you that perhaps arresting him might have gone a bit too far, but certainly I think people have a right to be concerned that, and I think it is right to say that he is a racist. If his Twitter feed is a reflection of how he genuinely feels. He has said that this is all a joke, so calling people who look like Muslims towel heads, referring to Muslims or people as Islamic bastards, Islamic bastards, vote Trump if you hate Islam. He is a racist, isn't he? Or an Islamophobe, at least.
Based on those comments, absolutely. And he himself retracted his original quote, which has been parodied so much, saying that he could not feature everything which he meant in the whole story within 140 characters. And that's indefensible. I think you can't really apply that retrospectively as you're writing it.
But this brings us back to something I mentioned about Islamophobia and what looks like its growth. Do not people in positions of power, businessmen like Rupert Murdoch, Donald Trump, who might be a politician this time next year, and also David Cameron, should they not be more responsible with the type of language that they use? You had David Cameron back in January or February this year saying that he believes Muslim women are, quote, traditionally submissive. So that's a hugely irresponsible stereotype and prejudiced view to take. Do statements like that not fuel Islamophobia? He also said back in 2011, Muslims must embrace British values as if they don't already, as if they are a backward, uncivilized group. Imagine the outcry if he'd said that about Jews. Jews must embrace British values. Sikhs must embrace British values. Hindus must embrace British values. Why is it all right for David Cameron to say this about Muslims? Why is it all right for him to say it about any group of people? Also, well, first of all, let me just ask you that. Why is it all right for David Cameron to say things like that? Why is it acceptable for the Prime Minister of a liberal democracy to target a minority and get away with it?
Well, firstly, it's not acceptable. Muslims do embrace British values to a great degree. You always have exceptions, but then, of course, you have some British-born people who don't accept British values anyway.
But they're from all races and all religions.
Oh, absolutely.
Or no
we
religions.
can't discriminate along those lines. To your question about why is it okay, it's not okay. Mr. Cameron has made these statements perhaps by a media-driven agenda, i.e. he can then use these statements to point out how he's defending Britain, but then you have the enemy within rather than the enemy without.
But the man that you would like to see as the next leader of the Conservative Party, and probably, well, I'd assume the next Prime Minister, is Boris Johnson. He's also said some pretty distasteful thing about Muslims, which could be seen to maybe not Islamophobic in themselves, but leading to the type of Islamophobia which informs the opinions of people like Matthew Doyle and others. What would you say about Boris Johnson saying similar things?
Well, I'm not convinced that I would like him to be Prime Minister yet. He certainly has potential, but I've not yet made up my mind. Any comments which target a particular group, whoever the group might be, have no place here. And so instead of trying to ride out the popular vote on, you know, there's Muslims on one side, there's us on the other, that's simply not the case.
So, Boris Johnson, what would your words of advice be to him? Because he has come close to the bone several times when speaking about minorities, and not just Muslims, but referring to young black youths in London, where he is the mayor. What advice would you give him to not go down the road of David Cameron, who is arguably demonising and stereotyping and leading to a lack of social cohesion? What advice would you give to Mr. Johnson for the future if he is to take the role of Cameron one day?
Mr. Johnson's a lot more experienced than I am. I'm not sure if I'm qualified to advise him, but
well, you seem to be a lot more level-headed, to be fair. You seem to be a lot more level-headed and open-minded than he does, going by what he said, in the past when it comes to Muslims.
If I had to advise him, I would say you are probably the most popular politician in Britain. Embrace all British society. Embrace all British
society. Okay, let's move on then from Boris Johnson. He, as I said, and a point I made earlier, there is a danger that people in positions of power are making statements which are leading to a rise of Islamophobia. I've mentioned David Cameron, I've mentioned Rupert Murdoch, Donald Trump. There is a website called the IslamophobiaNetwork.org. Now, they have been doing some research over the past 16, 17 years or so, and what they have found is that there are, in America, a number of organizations which are giving money to other organizations and other individuals who are spreading an Islamophobic narrative. Some names that come up in that network: Daniel Pipes, I'm not sure if you've heard of him, the Middle East Forum. But let me just give you a breakdown of some of the companies who have raised, according to this website, a total of, or rather contributed, a total of $57 million to promote Islamophobia between 2001 and 2012. You have an organization called Donors Capital Fund, the Russell Berry Foundation, Newton D. and Rochelle F. Becker Foundations and Charitable Trust, Allen and Hope Winners and Family Foundation, Rosenwald Middle Road Abstraction Fund, Scaife Foundation. Now, what's interesting is these organizations have given money, $57 million, as I've said, between those years, to many organizations, one of them being the think tank, the Middle East Forum, run by Daniel Pipes. On its website, the Middle East Forum says that it exists to, quote, promote American interests in the Middle East and protect Western values from Middle Eastern threats. Now, what does promote American interests in the Middle East mean? Well, perhaps Hillary Clinton could tell us a bit about that, because what's been leaked this week are some emails that were sent between Hillary Clinton's office and Google. This has been leaked by WikiLeaks. These leaked emails from Hillary Clinton's advisors show Google designed and used an interactive tracker, innocent so far, recording the number of people, innocent so far, defecting from Assad's regime in Syria in order to boost the confidence of and recruiting tactics of the rebels. Now, we know that many of those rebels have gone on to become terrorists, like the terrorists responsible for the attacks in Brussels on earlier this week. Now, one email was written by a Jared Cohen. He was a Clinton advisor until 2010. He's now a president of Jigsaw, formerly known as Google Ideas, the company's New York-based policy think tank. This is what he wrote in the email. Our logic, or one of the emails, our logic behind this is that while many people are tracking the atrocities, nobody is visually representing and mapping the defections, which we believe are important in encouraging more to defect and giving confidence to the opposition. Now, why would Google, a technology company, be interested in stabilizing a Middle Eastern country? Another interesting leak here, rather, quote, Jared Cohen visited Syria in 2010 with Alec Ross, another advisor to Clinton, who then wrote about his visit in 2010, quote, that there were in Syria, quote, disruptions in society that we could potentially harness for our purposes. What are Google's purposes? When you look at the fact that there are corporations, businesses, foundations pumping money into an Islamophobic network, the Middle East, Google, a multinational corporation, so close to potentially the next president of the United States, involved in the conflict in Syria, helping to destabilize the country, visiting it before it was destabilized, saying that disruptions could be beneficial for our purposes. Not clear what our purposes are, but Eric Schmidt, the former chief executive of Google, now heading a Pentagon advisory board aimed at bringing Silicon Valley in line with the best practice, Silicon Valley helping Silicon Valley innovation apply to the US military and improving its best practices. This was the new Defense Innovation Advisory Board, which Schmidt is a member of. It would give the Pentagon access to the brightest technical minds. Eric Schmidt, Google, part of the military-industrial complex, involved in the destabilizing of Syria. Obviously, an Islamophobic network, as it has been said here, is funding American interests in the Middle East. American interests in the Middle East, according to Google, are the growth, it seems, of the military-industrial complex. Is Islamophobia being used as a guise to meddle in the Middle East, to say, look at these Muslims, they're backwards, we need to go and bomb them, we need to get involved, we need to offer regime change, just to grow the military-industrial complex?
It's a lot of information to digest at once. In terms of the military complex, of course, there are business interests, and the Anglo-American business model is built on shareholder value, promoting interests to generate returns for your shareholders. So there is an element there. You mentioned regime change. That has certainly been an element of US foreign policy in the past, whereby they believe that they can implant a liberal democracy into a country where previously hasn't had the same values. That doesn't happen overnight. So regime change, what we've seen in Iraq, that's drastically backfired because, of course, democracy has meant many different things at many different times.
Okay, but what I'm trying to do is find the link, because there obviously is one when you've got very wealthy individuals backing so-called academics and scholars who say who do put out Islamophobic papers, make Islamophobic statements on the likes of Fox News, in the Washington Times as well, Daniel Pikes being one example, and then saying on their websites, our aims are to promote American interests in the Middle East. What's the connection? Is there a connection there between Islamophobia, the funding of Islamophobes, and the promoting of American interests in the Middle East, when you have Google saying that it wants to take advantage of disruptions in the Middle East, and then a year later a civil war breaks out, and then they implement a tool to help the cause of the rebels fighting the regime? Is there a connection there, one that we won't hear about in Rupert Murdoch's The Times or The Sun?
It might be circumstantial. Admittedly, I would think that what's happened in Syria, the revolt, everything else that's gone on, isn't to do with a technology giant trying to use a data tool. It has happened on grounds of persecution and all other factors which have been a response to Now, if you're saying that, for example, Google has tried to help the rebels in any such capacity, then I wouldn't say it's necessarily the cause of American interests, and at least not so nefariously. There is a possibility of it, but it can't be guaranteed. As I say, it's circumstantial.
But should a multinational corporation like Google be involved in a civil war in a foreign country?
It's difficult to tell because Google is used for so many different things. It's going to be used, or at least accessed, by certain groups in some way. If you're talking about central direction, then I don't believe it does.
So should we be looking more into this? Are you concerned about this at all? Because a lot of people would be. Are you concerned, or does this look fairly innocuous, if not benevolent to you?
It doesn't seem benevolent, no, but we'd have to review with more time to reach a conclusion. Those strands which you've drawn on, obviously you have Hillary Clinton, the American money that goes into Hillary Clinton's campaign, same as it does for other candidates. There will be some sources which won't be properly explained with the billions that go into it. There might be something there, but I don't think it's necessarily a grand conspiracy as might be purported.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, what if that was to happen, if a similar link was to be shown between David Cameron and multinational corporations, or the Conservative Party and multinational corporations? Would you be concerned then? I'm
concerned about that as it is, but then of course I would be concerned about that going on as well, because the interest is so colluded.
You're concerned about the influence of corporations on the Conservative Party at the moment, did you say?
If that's what you're asking, well, there has been big business interest in the past. I mean, look at Lord Ashcroft, for example, who was a huge donor, great pollster for the Conservative Party, and as the Call Me Dave book seems to reveal, he was actively seeking a ministerial office. He didn't get that and so published the book. So that's not just the one example. There are plenty of business interests that go on, but then there's also other interests that go into what happens with the Conservative Party.
Okay, we're going to take a break in just a minute, and then we're going to move on and look at some other stories. But I want to ask you about Lynton Crosby. Lynton Crosby is a man who arguably is exploiting Islamophobia with his dead cat strategy, for example. And you'll know about that, the dead cat tactic that he uses, the Ed Miliband being a backstabber type thing. It's come out in recent newspaper reports that although Zac Goldsmith, we're not sure if he's being advised by Lynton Crosby in his mayoral election, has been using a strategy of divide and conquer between ethnic minorities to try and put people off voting for Sadiq Khan. He's been telling British Indians and Sri Lankans not to vote for Sadiq Khan because he would, first of all, he is against Modi, apparently, according to Zac Goldsmith, and secondly, he would tax the family jewellery that he believes Indian families possess, gold jewellery. Now, many people have criticised Zac Goldsmith for being stereotypical, patronising. Other people have said he's using typical conservative divide and conquer strategies or tactics in the election campaign. Other people have said he was racist. I don't think he was racist. I don't agree with them, but I agree with the other criticisms. That has Lynton Crosby all over it, though, doesn't it? To attack Sadiq Khan because the Indians might think, oh, well, he's a Muslim, he doesn't support a Hindu nationalist Prime Minister Modi, so let's exploit that tension to try and win the London mayoral election. That's Lynton Crosby all over that, isn't it?
I couldn't say either way. I don't know with certainty, and I wouldn't want to allege otherwise. If you're saying there are similar tactics, there is a possibility, sure.
Do you approve of the tactics Lynton Crosby had been advising David Cameron to use in the run-up to the 2015 general election? For example, this attack on Ed Miliband being a backstabber, when press time could have been used more productively and constructively to talk about tax loopholes.
Sure, I mean, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing almost a presidentialization of the office of Prime Minister, where it's the ethos, it involves the character and trying to defame that in any way possible, rather than having more time constructively spent on policy and how these issues will affect people.
So as Secretary of or Office Manager and Secretary of the Bow Group, the oldest conservative think tank in this country, if you had your way, if the Bow Group had their way, would you say, Lynton Crosby, keep him away from the Conservative Party from now on, because he's divisive to society as a whole?
You are suggesting that there has been some division aimed as a strategy, but remember, Lynton Crosby has, at least he has helped the Conservative Party to win a majority, so...
A very small one, by 12 MPs. But is it constructive to win a majority based on divide and conquer?
Well, that would be an aggregative result rather than the means by which you actually go about it, which in the long run may actually be more useful if you are doing this as a way of not promoting divide and conquer, as you keep mentioning. I think that Linton Crosby certainly has his qualities, but then this divide and conquer which you allege, and there's no way to independently verify if he is advising Zach Goldsmith.
Well, as far as I'm aware, he's not at the moment. As far as I'm aware, he's not. But it looks like he certainly had an influence on the electoral tactics, so the election campaign tactics that they're using. But we're going to take a break. Do stay with us. We'll be back in a little over a minute with more of the Daily Pages.
Go Brick Green, your local energy efficient green deal company. Claim your free boiler today and save hundreds of pounds on your energy bill. Our qualified installers will fit a brand new boiler within days of your application. Call now on 01254 278 354 or register online at gobrickgreen.co.uk. Free boiler, free installation, call today.
Was there a delay before you received your medical treatment? Did the doctor or hospital misdiagnose your condition? Why did your surgery not go right the first time? Do you think the doctor or hospital may have been negligent? If so, you might have a case for clinical negligence. At Joseph Fraser Solicitors, we will be on your side and can help you through your clinical negligence case. Call 08456 537 529 or visit our website at jfsllp.co.uk.
जिंदगी संवारें और अपना कारोबार बढ़ाएं। आपकी अपनी नई दुकान मैनचेस्टर प्लाजा में क्यों ना हो, जहां 50 से ज़ायद दुकानें आपकी मुंतज़िर हैं। आज ही बुकिंग के लिए 0161 740 3116 पर राब्ता करें।
Clifton Restaurant Complex and Banquet Venue in Bradford, West Yorkshire. A majestic choice of 4 floors, tailored for any occasion. The Gilgit Lounge, Hunza and Astor Lounge, boasting a capacity of 450 seats, 18 washrooms and private valet car parking. Ideal for weddings, mehndis, chai parties and birthday parties. Currently serving you a buffet and a la carte menu. Come and visit us today in Bradford, the curry capital of Europe, and book your special event today on 01274 494420. That's Bradford 01274 494420.
जिंदगी संवारें और अपना कारोबार बढ़ाएं। आपकी अपनी नई दुकान मैनचेस्टर प्लाजा में क्यों ना हो, जहां 50 से ज़ायद दुकानें आपकी मुंतज़िर हैं। आज ही बुकिंग के लिए 0161 740 3116 पर राब्ता करें।
Pearl Travel presents 10 days tour to India. Visit holy shrines of great saints and Indian historic landmarks such as Hazrat Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar, Hazrat Nizamuddin Auliya, Mughal Emperor Humayun's tomb of Safdarjung, the Red Fort, Kalyar Sharif, Hazrat Ali Shah Qalandar, Shrine of Hazrat Mujahid Al-Sani, Amber Fort, Sheesh Mahal, Bulwan Darwaza Agra, Hazrat Salim Chishti, Taj Mahal, and special visit to Sultan-e-Hind, Hazrat Mohyuddin Chishti, Gharib Nawaz, Ajmer Sharif.
सबकी भरती है झोलियां ये दरे गरीब नवाज है।
Flights from the UK to Delhi Airport. Packages include visa, ticket, hotel and tour guide. Full board included, all airport transfers are included, full itinerary provided, and transport is also provided. Visas available for all nationalities, including Pakistani nationals. For more information, call Pearl Travel on 01254 278 354 or 7889 022 703. Or you can email us at info@pearl-travel.co.uk.
If a fault on
Welcome back to the Daily Pages with me, Nafis Mahmood, and my guest this evening, Hector Marchetti of the Bold Group, the oldest conservative think tank in this country. Hector, we were talking about Islamophobia in different contexts beforehand and a number of related issues. Let's move on to our next headline. It's from Reuters, taken from Reuters directly. The headline reads, Syrian government forces enter Islamic State-held Palmyra. Pretty self-explanatory, that headline there, but that would not be happening. Assad would not be about to, what is most likely going to happen, reclaim territory from IS if it was not for the support of Putin. Is that the case?
Absolutely. The Russians, while they are withdrawing, they are still providing air support. That's how the Assad forces are able to move into Palmyra.
So that then raises the question, who is more effective in defeating IS? Is it the Russians and Assad, or is it the US-led coalition, which includes countries like Saudi Arabia and Jordan? Who is more effective? Because in just 6 months, or just a little over 6 months, Russia is helping Assad to reclaim territory from IS. It's taken America 18 months to do the same with Ramadi in Iraq. Who's more effective?
Superficially, you look at the military strategy, it would be Putin, but then that is because Mr. Putin has Mr. Assad as his ally. Therefore, they have greater cooperation than the Western coalition does, because, of course, it was only some years ago in the House of Commons they were debating to bomb Assad.
Yeah, in 2013, and to be helping individuals and groups who have now gone on to form IS.
Absolutely.
Very
so
strange. Google might have had a hand in that, who knows, but let's see.
That's up for grabs.
But the question there is then, if America, Britain, the US-led coalition, NATO, all the rest of it, whatever you want to call them, if they are so serious about defeating IS, would the wise thing not have been to consult with Putin, saying, Assad is your ally, you guys go in there and you get rid of these head choppers who are a threat to all of us?
Daesh are a threat to all of us. The problem then is that you have still boiling tensions between the West and Putin in Russia.
But could they not have been negotiated or put to one side, surely, to defeat this menace, IS, which Cameron, Obama, they all tell us is the greatest threat we've ever faced since Nazism, apparently. Surely some things are worth working together for, and that is, in this case, the defeating of IS. I'm getting at, are America, Britain, are they really serious about defeating IS, or does bombing them help to pull up the share prices of Lockheed Martin and BAE Systems and fund this military-industrial complex that we've been talking about?
If that happens, then it might still be an unfair angle. Let's look at what's going on. You have Assad, who 2 years ago used chemical weapons on his own people.
That was debated, though, wasn't it? We're not sure who used what, actually. The United Nations, I believe, came out and said it might have been opposition forces. Interestingly, supported by Cameron and Obama.
Well, I think the evidence does incline more towards Mr. Assad having used his chemical weapons. So there is a reluctance, especially even if there is more confusion about who actually used it, for the West to intervene more effectively. Whereas Russia has a clear line to Mr. Assad and they can coordinate better. That's why the West has not been able to act so effectively as Russia has.
So who is... Russia is being very effective then. Should America pull out then? If Russia is doing the job of defeating IS, should America pull out or descale its activities in the region? America and Britain, it's the US-led coalition.
Not necessarily, because Russia now is withdrawing, and furthermore, we can't think of this as a short-term issue.
Their withdrawal was before, was about 2 weeks ago, and despite that withdrawal, they're still about to defeat IS in Palmyra, it seems.
In Palmyra, sure, but it's going to take a longer time to defeat ISIS, and then we have to question what happens after, not just with IS, but with the whole region destabilized. There might be a power grab in certain places through territorial gains. IS controlled some regions of former Iraq. Could Assad forces try claim those for any strategic value? And then once IS hopefully is defeated, what comes after IS? You're still going to have to deal with the Assad regime, whether Assad remains as president or not. And then you still have the militia groups and the rebels. How do you deal with them? Do you offer clemency, hopefully, so as to restore peace? In which case, as a great lady said, you can't swing the pendulum too far. So therefore, if we have all groups involved still, there might be more lines of communication open by which to deal with IS now, and then anything which might arise in the future.
Okay, well, we'll see how that pans out. Let's move closer to home, or right back home. A headline from The Independent. George Osborne defends blocking analysis that shows how much money he takes from the poor and gives to the rich. Well, they've stated that in a way that perhaps there's a bit more to the story than the headline suggests, but let's take a look at it. So basically, after the general election, the Conservative government, scrapped the part of the distribution analysis which shows how different income groups are affected by changes made in budgets and autumn statements. Now, the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said that many households in the bottom 20% of earners will end up losing about 12% of their income by 2019, while households in the top half of the income scale would not lose anything. Is that perhaps the reason why Osborne wants to get rid of this part of the distribution analysis, which would make such things transparent?
Well, the IFS used the old model, which has been outdated, scrapped by the Treasury, and George Osborne now uses a system whereby it's by income quintiles and tax proportion. The problem here is that Osborne has ring-fenced so many other budgets that it's difficult to draw on the necessary amount by which to counter the U-turn by the personal independence payments, and then also still to find the 4.4 billion needed within the Treasury cuts.
Is there a need for 4.4 billion in Treasury cuts, though? Because if you can have quantitative easing for banks to bail them out, if money can just be effectively, right, do you agree with me on this? Money can just be printed. Because that's what happened, didn't it, with quantitative easing. Money was printed and went to the banks. If people are dying, right, now printing money is not obviously going to be the best thing to do in any circumstance because of inflation and all kinds of stuff. But if that was the case to bail out bankers, the risk was that they might lose their jobs, and also no, they were going to lose their job. The risk was that if we don't do that, they'll go elsewhere. They'll pack up and go elsewhere. What about when it comes to saving people's lives? 2,300 people have died as a result of having their payments stopped by Ian Duncan Smith because they were told the government cannot afford this and we want to help you get back into work. We can't afford this. We can't afford welfare. People have died as a result. Wouldn't it be worth some quantitative easing to save thousands of lives?
I agree that you can print money, but then there would be some consequences to that. You mentioned inflation, but then where does it go?
But if it can be used, because there were billions pushed into the markets, surely 4.4 billion to save lives is the only ethical solution, not chopping more from the budget and leaving more people to die, as may happen despite this U-turn, this apparent U-turn, because you can't trust Osborne, can you? He said the government plans not to cut welfare, not saying they will not cut welfare, but leave that to the side for 1 minute. Quantitative easing to help the most vulnerable in society. That's just what an ethical, sane-minded, warm-hearted person would do if he was at the reins of the government finances in a liberal democracy.
It's not so easy to find the 4.4 billion needed. If you're cutting it from the Treasury, or not cutting it in this case, where do you find it from? Who else is going to be affected?
But that's what I'm saying, quantitative easing. If you can give it to the banks to keep the economy running, why not give it to the people who keep the economy running, right? Money keeps the economy running, money keeps the economy running on one side, people keep the economy running on the other side. If you can give it to the markets, why not give it to the people, without whom there would be no markets?
Well, sure, I agree with that last point, but then if you are printing so much money, then instead of being able to help people, everything might just run off into the distance. You would have no control over what's going on.
As happened in the Square Mile, before quantitative easing, which led us to the financial meltdown, which Osborne says is the reason why he's having to effectively, you could argue, be responsible for the manslaughter of people on benefits. But interesting, because Osborne, it's only a matter of time before he's kicked out, isn't it? Because look, his flagship policy, he's apparently the mastermind behind the conservatism that won the election in 2010 just and in 2015 just. He's arguably, he claims to be the mastermind behind that, and that's what political commentators tell us. His flagship policy was to reduce the deficit to balance the books. Has Mr. Osborne done that himself, or George Wasborne yesterday, if we were to give him his correct name? Certainly that's what you'd think his name was, going by his track record. He certainly was born yesterday and can't use a calculator, and has certainly not read Accountancy for Dummies or How to be a Chancellor of Exchequer for Dummies. Current UK debt, 1.5 trillion. He's increased UK debt, he's increased government borrowing, and yet he says he was the man that was, or his party was the party that was elected to do the opposite of such things. He's not lived up to his flagship policy. By 2015, we were told that he would have Britain living within its means. Now he's saying by 2019, 2020, there's been a shambles over this budget. In the House of Commons, they had to vote on a budget that came to no conclusion. We're not sure where the money's going to come from to pay for these to bridge this 4.4 billion deficit. And yet the House of Commons had to vote on that. This man is incompetent and should be sacked for gross misconduct. He should not have to resign. He should be sacked for gross misconduct.
There's several points there. Firstly, that Osborne won't be kicked out because he's so close personally and politically to David Cameron. Whether, as you say, his number is called up when there's the Conservative Party election leadership campaign, that might be a different story if he's accepted or not.
Okay, I'm sorry for interrupting there, but Tory cronyism to one side, or chumism between Cameron and Osborne. Let's look at the electorate, because it was campaign groups like Disabled People Against Cuts, People's Assembly Against Austerity, which raised awareness of what IDS, Ian Duncan Smith, was actually up to, which you have to say, well, let's put it this way, arguably contributed to Ian Duncan Smith having to resign before he was pushed last Friday. The same is going to happen to Osborne. People know, this is not widely reported by the likes of the BBC, UK debt 1.5 trillion, 82% of GDP, borrowing increased more in 2010 to 2013 at the hands of Osborne, more than it did in the previous 13 years, 1997 to 2010 under Labour, who he claims to be clearing the mess of, or their mess up. More and more people are knowing this. There's going to be more and more pressure on Osborne, and he's going to have to do an IDS in the next year or two, if not a lot sooner, maybe even before the autumn statement. Osborne's days are numbered. He may as well leave now. Bye, Osborne. Don't you think so?
Not necessarily. To deal with the economic argument, there is a difference between the debt and the deficit. Now, I agree that George Osborne has borrowed more than Gordon Brown. He has increased our national debt. But then while telling us
that Gordon Brown was responsible, which he partly was, for the mess, and he was going to clean it up. He lied to us then, didn't he? Osborne is a liar. We can't have liars in the House of Commons. Osborne must resign.
Well, I'm worried that there are several lies in the House of Commons as is, not just Mr. Osborne, if what you're alleging is true. But then what you need to consider is that Mr. Osborne is dealing with the deficit in terms of trying to get a budget surplus of 10 billion by 2020. Once that's done, then
how's he going to get that? Quantitative easing? Ask his friends at Goldman Sachs to print it for him?
Well, I don't think that he'd be inspired by quantitative easing despite having borrowed more money. What you need to also think about is in terms of how Osborne is going to, well, what you mentioned with the narrative that he's put out about austerity. So despite having said that the cuts are going to have to take place, he hasn't actually put austerity in as a viable mechanism, i.e. he has borrowed more, admittedly. And so it suits Labour as well to say that there are these Tories doing the cuts.
Do you support austerity?
If it were to be put in as the theory holds, then yes, right now it hasn't been, because it is a viable economic strategy.
Okay, that it may be, but the argument is it's being used for ideological purposes now. Many people say it's being used to punish the poor, to create social injustice, and using the financial fallout or the financial crash as a smokescreen for that. But let's move on from Osborne. Let's move on to another man, Jeremy Corbyn, who is always often in the headlines. Today he's in the headline for a rather strange reason. From the Telegraph, the headline reads, "Vegetarian Jeremy Corbyn attends British Kebab Awards as he calls on Nation to eat salad with them." Now that's quite hilarious. I don't want to get into his dietary preferences. What I do want to ask you is, what do you think of Mr. Corbyn?
He's one of those rare things nowadays where he's a conviction politician. He says what he believes. And while I don't agree with what he's saying, that is admirable.
There was a recent YouGov poll done which for the first time put Labour ahead of the Conservatives by 1 point, 34 to 33. Admittedly a very narrow lead, but what do you make of that?
That poll did come out when the fallout from Ian Duncan Smith resigning was occurring, so perhaps there is some extenuating factors in terms of lack of confidence in the government at present which contributed to that increased surge, however minimal it might be. I don't believe that any such poll would hold until the 2020 general election.
Well, we'll wait and see what happens there. But I want to move on to our next headline now, which is from the Telegraph. Again, excuse me, the headline reads, "Cap number of foreign nurses coming to Britain, say official advisors." So this is the Home Office's Migration Advisory Committee. It has said that the government has failed to plan ahead and train enough homegrown staff. So that is Jeremy Hunt's responsibility, the Secretary of State for Health. They want a cap of 3,000 to 500 nurses coming from outside Europe every year. Only 3,000 to 5,000 nurses outside of Europe a year they want coming into the country. They say the government needs, well, the government itself says it needs 14,000 nurses between now and 2020. So if there is this deficit of nurses wherever they're coming from, and the government is saying, sorry, the Home Office's Migration Advisory Committee is saying we need more, or we should have more homegrown nurses, wasn't Osborne again revealing himself to be a completely inadequate Chancellor of the Exchequer by announcing cuts to the way that nursing training is funding? Just in his autumn statement last year, he scrapped bursaries for trainee nurses, replacing them with loans instead. Now, loans could put off many people from wanting to train as nurses because many nurses are mature students. They already have loans and families to feed and debts on those loans. We already have a shortage of midwives, 2,600, and many trainee nurses who go on to become midwives or train to become midwives are mature students with children, with previous debts, from previous degrees or various other, for various other reasons. Osborne and Jeremy Hunt need to talk more to each other, or Osborne has no idea what he's doing, and this is another example of him being completely incompetent.
Not necessarily. Right now what you have is last year 8,000 non-UK national nurses were brought in, and it does show that without this contribution the NHS would fall apart overnight. Now the advisory committee have recommended that, as you say, we reduce the number in that regard and that we incentivise people to train as nurses to help support through a domestic element. What you mentioned about loans is not necessarily true, because people who want to go into nursing have a certain passion for it outside of the finance, but then also once they're earning the wage, then they will be able to pay back those loans. I appreciate that it may not be so straightforward as that all the time, but then it is a passion to go into the health profession. I don't know why many people would do so otherwise.
Well, Osborne did say that that would save the government £800 million a year, switching from bursaries to loans. But let's just take a look at our next story then, because it's related to saving money from the health budget and for the government overall. It's from the International Business Times. Junior doctors strike. Jeremy Hunt branded a disgrace for missing Commons grilling. That's perhaps another resignation that is due. Ian Duncan-Smith, Osborne, and then Jeremy Hunt. It may mean that Cameron himself has to resign. But let's take a look at the story in a little more detail. Mr. Hunt failed to turn up to the Commons today to face questions from the opposition over the forthcoming junior doctor strike, the first to remove or not provide emergency care ever. Minister Ben Gummer sent in his place. I believe he's a junior minister. Yes. He was criticised, or Hunt was criticised by Heidi Alexander, the Shadow Health Secretary, who said today, "This is a worrying time for patients and the NHS, and it is nothing short of a disgrace that yet again the Health Secretary has failed to turn up. If this walkout goes ahead, this will be the first time ever junior doctors have fully withdrawn their labour. Nobody wants this to happen." Why? What's going on here? Why is Jeremy Hunt going against what the public want, because they support the junior doctors, and imposing his will in this contract?
I can't excuse Mr. Hunt for not attending, but what do you say about what the public want? I think the BMA, the British Medical Association, does have a particular agenda and a strong lobby as well. It has done in recent years. The contracts themselves were put in place in 1990, and negotiations to re-establish them were put in 2012. Negotiations broke down in 2014. And what's happened is the BMA has repeatedly now turned down the opportunity to get back to the negotiating table. The junior doctor strike, which will now, as you say, have emergency care out of place, that will happen between the 4th and 6th of April with emergency care only, but then also the 26th and the 27th of April, which is almost at the end of the month. So perhaps the BMA is hoping that they won't have to do a full walkout in those 2 or 3 intermittent weeks. Something will come up in terms of negotiation. But although I'm sympathetic that there might be working condition concerns, the new contract does increase pay. It does reduce working hours, and it also prevents doctors from working consecutive weekends. And if doctors are working the 1st and the 4th weekend of the month, they'll have a 30% boost to it. So I do think that before the worst happens and patients' lives are lost, both sides need to get around to the negotiating table.
Okay. You mentioned that the BMA have an agenda and they are lobbied. What's their agenda and who are they lobbied by?
I'm concerned that the BMA is right now not representing all junior doctor interests. I believe there might be a political bias towards the left wing with what's going on right now. Okay,
well, let's take a look at agendas and who's lobbying who, because Jeremy Hunt co-authored a book in 2005, or at least it was published in 2005. It was called Direct Democracy, and on page 78 were written the following words, quote, "Our ambition should be to break down the barriers between private and public provision, in effect, denationalising the provision of healthcare in Britain, so extending to all the choices currently available only to the minority who opt for private provision." Now, the latter half of that sounds quite benevolent, but the troubling words, in effect, denationalising the provision of healthcare in Britain. Jeremy Hunt has an agenda here. The Conservative government has an agenda here, because Michael Gove was also a co-author of this, as were a number of other Conservative MPs, to denationalise the National Health Service. Do you support privatisation? And if so, why would it be a good thing for people in Britain?
I currently don't support privatising national healthcare. I think that that would be quite disastrous. The welfare state is there to provide a safety net for people. But although there might be some agenda, I don't think that that might ever be put forward as policy. I think it would be politically dangerous. But then it's not just the Conservative Party who have explored this option. Let's not forget that under New Labour, it was Mr Blair who put forward first private
PFIs, private.
Well, that was building on
function.
what John Major had introduced, sure.
Yeah.
But Blair did carry that on and introduced private healthcare in North Wales, I believe.
Indeed, indeed. And the New Labour do not have a very good record when it comes to the NHS. And obviously, it seems that Tony Blair would agree with what was written here by, well, it's not clear who wrote this specific paragraph, but in this pamphlet co-authored by Michael Gove and Jeremy Hunt, I'm sure many people in New Labour who are still under Corbyn would agree, although Corbyn himself would not agree with denationalising the provision of healthcare in Britain, as Jeremy Hunt obviously wants to see happening. But this leads to another question, doesn't it, of agenda. It would be disastrous for any politician or any political party to come out and say, we're going to denationalise the NHS. But there is an argument that it's been done by stealth, or has been done by stealth, going right back to Margaret Thatcher's days, by the Conservatives, by New Labour, and obviously currently by the Conservatives, that they want to bit by bit demolish the NHS so that the argument is easier to come in and say, well, let's just privatise it, that's the only option.
There has been discussion if that has been occurring in the background, sure. I don't think that'll ever become a fully fledged option, though.
Okay, why not? Why not? Because we've been seeing more and more steps towards internal marketisation, sourcing out to private contractors. Lockheed Martin were allowed to bid for a contract, the arms company in the NHS. So we're seeing more and more of that happening. If it carries on, inevitably, there will be full-scale privatisation.
Well, to answer your question, expanding public choice doesn't necessarily mean that the whole institution is going to be privatised. I think that there are elements where you can have more of a market-style approach, but then the key thing to remember is not to privatise the whole system and ensure that people do get healthcare when they need it.
Okay, but healthcare, of course, is what we're talking about here, and when you do go out to the markets, this is what happens. In Hitchinbrook, the first private hospital, although it's under the NHS tag, but the first private hospital to be, or NHS hospital to be run by a private company, run by Circle, in Hitchinbrook, pulled out recently in 2014 and went into special measures. The Care Quality Commission said the level of service to patients was inadequate. Presumably that's because Circle were more interested in cutting costs to maximise profits. It's the first time the Care Quality Commission has ruled a hospital trust as being inadequate. Another example, a private hospital run by Clinicenta was terminated because it was failing to provide adequate care to patients. At least 3 people died, 8,500 patient records were lost, and the government, taxpayers, had to buy it out, £54 million. Private providers themselves received more than £10 billion from public coffers in 2013. In 2014, £5.8 billion worth of NHS work was given to, or was being advertised to the private sector. With results like this, the CQC saying they're inadequate, arguably or presumably because they want to cut costs, it's nuts to outsource private healthcare to the private market at an increasing rate because patients are going to suffer.
There is that danger, sure, but then there's also it's sad cases where you've had NHS public hospitals fail to meet standards.
But not because they were going to cut costs, maybe for other reasons, but not because they necessarily wanted to cut costs to make a profit. And that's the underlying argument. It's what comes first, profit or people. Inevitably, when you give it out to the market, the principle is profit, and that's not a good motive to start from or principle to have when you're talking about life and death situations like people's healthcare.
Absolutely not, I agree with you.
So that means then we should not be increasing marketisation of the NHS, which you earlier said you think is a good thing?
I didn't say that privatising or marketising all of it would be a good idea. I think that you do need to provide a safety net. I think that's why I support free healthcare at the point of service. But then there are options to explore. There's no harm in looking at debate because right now the NHS is facing dire financial straits. We should never put profit above people, absolutely. But we do need to look at how the system functions right now in the modern world.
We do indeed, and you did say there that it's always good to look at the debate, and that's what we've been doing when we're talking about different stories this evening. It's been a pleasure. You said you wanted the information. I said the conversation would be robust. You said you wanted it to be robust as much as I wanted it to be, but so long as it was informative and constructive. Was it those two things?
I think so. I think we touched on a number of bases.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Perhaps we'll have you back on again in the future. It'll be a pleasure. I'd like to thank my guest, Hector Marchetti of the Bold Group, the oldest Conservative think tank in this country. I'd like to thank the viewers at home for tuning in this evening. We'll be taking a break because it's the Easter holiday weekend, but we'll be back on Tuesday at 11:20 right here on Ummah Channel with more of the Daily Pages. Until then, Assalamu alaikum.